My name is Adrian, and along with my colleague Tammy, we'll be your hosts this evening. So, as we meet tonight, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands and waterways we join you from, to recognise their living cultures and ongoing connection to country, and to pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. It's my pleasure to welcome here tonight the respected journalist and critic Richard King to discuss Here Be Monsters, his topical rumination on the influence of modern technology on human society and indeed humanity itself. How are you going this evening, Richard?
Very well, thank you, Adrian. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you here. So we're going to conduct this evening's talk as an interview, and midway through, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Throughout the session, Tammy is going to be keeping an eye on the Zoom chat function. So if you have a question or a comment that you'd like to jot down during the meeting, please do pop it in the chat. And then when we get to the questions, Tammy will have that there to refer to. Also, just a reminder that with several people online, if we can all keep our microphones turned off unless we're actually talking, that helps with the sound quality. Okay, so let's get started then. Richard, Here Be Monsters is a book about technology and society. And the scope is quite broad. You discuss a wide range of technologies and a wide range of scientific fields, and you delve into various social phenomena. But is there one single thing, perhaps, a story you saw in the news or a time someone told you about a new technology gone bad that really persuaded you and motivated you and made you think, I'm going to write a book about that? Was there something that sort of sparked your intellectual endeavor with this?
It was more general than that, to be honest, Adrian. I think, and it's interesting that you put it, a technology gone bad, because what really interests me, rather than, I mean, the technologies themselves are of course very important, but I'm also interested in our relationship to the technologies. So I think one of the things that's really now so ubiquitous and to which we're so habituated was probably always there in the background, and that's the smartphone. I mean, the smartphone has just revolutionized social life. It's a communication technology, of course. That means that it connects people, but it also it removes the necessity of being in the same, if you like, physical space. But what it was doing was introducing, if you like, relations of absence into those embodied spaces. So when you walk through a university campus now, whereas once, and I don't think I'm romanticizing, you would have seen people sort of, up and about and looking around and chatting and all this sort of thing. What you tend to see now is perhaps 50% of the students just looking down into their phones. And this slight movement of the head actually is very powerful social change, I think. I asked some students about 12 years ago, students, that's to say, who could remember a time before the smartphone and social media, or even mobile phones and social media. If I could give you your lives tomorrow without these things, would you take it? And they said yes. Almost all of them said yes. I tried the same experiment, and it's not, this experiment doesn't have much credibility, just a straw poll, but I did the same thing a couple of years ago, and a lot of the hardly anyone said yes, we'd take it. And a lot of the students looked at me as if I was a bit strange, to be honest. How would we connect with each other? So it's this, what one gets older, and one of the things about getting older is that you can either go one of two ways. You can be sort of reactive, and you can be sort of, oh well, I don't like the way all this is going, etc., or you can try and understand what's going on and use your knowledge of different kind of dispensations in order to subject those new situations, those new scenarios to some kind of analysis. And so I've tried to do the latter. But I mean, really, I mean, smartphones are just the sort of beginning of it. And we have seen an enormous, upswell in, some digital technologies in particular. Those are the ones that are kind of breaking ground. I think always bubbling underneath, though, for me, even more concerning in a way, was genetic technology, which hardly anyone is sort of talking about in those kind of humanistic terms, if you like, about what this means for society, what it means for us as individuals, for human beings, etc. So all of these technologies are very transformative. We'll come on to talk about this, I'm sure, but they're very transformative. They're technologies, I would argue, of a different order than the technologies that we've had in the past. So, I came into this book from various kind of angles that, as a writer, you're always thinking about, what can I write about as well? And and I was interested in this question of technology. I was interested in it from a humanistic perspective. And there seemed to me to be lots of books written from a sort of technological perspective by people who really knew the technology and knew what they were talking about. People like Professor Toby Walsh, who's fantastic, really lovely guy as well. And those books are very useful. But what I wanted to do, and in those books, you always have a kind of chapter or two at the end where they kind of move off into sort of philosophical or political speculation. And what I wanted to do was to come at it from the other end, and to bring whatever it is that I have as a cultural critic, if you like, to bear on this incredible change that's come over the culture in the last couple of decades. So that's a slightly rangy answer, but I think if I had to pick one thing, or a couple of things, genetic technology and what's happened there with CRISPR-Cas9 editing and that sort of thing, and the smartphone would be two things that really strike me as a revolution. One, a revolution in social life already. One, a revolution in social life in potentia, if you like.
Yes, yeah, that's quite interesting, because I think some people's instinctive reaction would be to see the smartphones as relatively benign, even though they would probably agree with you that technology like CRISPR and direct gene editing has the potential for great and rapid harm.
Yeah.
Early on, you spoke about relationships of absence. I was wondering if you could expand on that a bit, because I felt that was quite an interesting concept in your book.
Yeah, sure. Happy to, and it is quite a central aspect in the book. So the book is sort of but because I want to invite people to ask what they want from their technologies, that sort of necessitates a second question, which is, what are we? The question of what we want is also a question of what we are, and that's what makes this sort of techno-critical tradition within which I'm working sort of such a rich one, I think. And I've divided the book, to carry on from that. I've divided the book into three sections, which I think talk very, very broadly to sort of three fundamental aspects of our being. So there's our social being, there's our embodied or our physical being, and there's our creative being, which I think is very closely linked to the kind of freedom that we have as human beings. And in that first section, the social section, if you like, what I'm looking at above all are the communication technologies, which have a strange sort of double aspect. Communication technologies, obviously, by their nature, link us to one another, but they also separate us. So this is true of all communication technologies. Socrates, for example, was famously against writing anything down because he thought it would alter and effectively undermine the way in which he did philosophy, which was by wandering around the agora, talking to his students, arguing with his students. So he wanted that personal relationship. What you have now, and increasingly, are, if you like, relations of absence. People are connected, but the forms of connection that we have engender forms of disconnection, which I think in the end don't do us much good. And the reason they don't do us much good is because human sociality, that's to say the way in which we live in community with one another, evolved in conditions of physical presence. So if we didn't know it before COVID, we certainly knew it. We certainly got to realize pretty quickly that for whatever reason, it's not enough to have mum on the screen. You've got to have mum in the room. Sometimes, okay? Maybe not too much, but sometimes, okay? Mum needs to be in the room. The same, of course, with our children, with our friends, etc., etc., etc. I'm not interested in why this is, whether it's, no doubt there are people writing, papers on why it is that we need to be in the same space. It just is the case. And we don't do terribly well when we are physically separated from one another. And it seems to me that the kinds of technologies that we have, in particular digital technologies, particularly relevant to this, are making, if you like, these relations of absence ubiquitous. So it isn't just that it is possible now to talk to someone, I should say, over who isn't physically present to you, which of course means that you don't need to be physically present to them. These devices, especially the smartphone, now, as I was saying before, introduce these relations of absence into these relationships of presence, such that we are alone. Sherry Turkle, the American critic, says that we are alone together. It's a nice phrase, isn't it? We are alone together. So these relations of absence can take different forms, and I think they're not doing us much good. What happens then is that you get technologies, the smartphone and social media would be uppermost here, that sort of give us back the thing that we feel we're lacking, which is connection with others, but they do it, so to speak, in morbid form, in a way that doesn't give human beings the kind of recognition that they need in order to flourish. So it just sort of pulls our need for connection into this economy of likes and shares and all that sort of thing. Okay, so there's things like WhatsApp could obviously form part of a healthy sociality, but what's happening is that they're sort of replacing the sociality, so that the kids don't go out. Now I do sound like an old boomer, but it's true, it's absolutely true. The kids don't go out and play on their bikes and talk to one another. They sit in their rooms on their phones. I've got one doing it now. And
so we've just had a comment to a similar effect from Tammy in the chat.
Right, yeah. And it's not good for them. Okay, it's not good for us. It's not good for us. It's alienating. It's anxiety making, and we know this. We know this. There are good numbers suggesting that this is the case. So yeah. So that's what I mean by technologies of absence. There are other things as well. Take something like, because when I say technologies of absence, I'm not only talking about communications technologies. Take weaponry, for example. Weaponry is a good case of a technology where the distance between people sort of increases over historical time. So people used to fight, so to speak, face to face with swords or fists or clubs or whatever it was, stones, axes. And then you get the sort of longbow, and then you get the gun, and then you get weapons and all this sort of thing. What you now have emerging are weapons which no one is in control of at all, which are, in my terms, technologies not just of extension, but complete externalization. So that are sort of patrolling the skies around parts of over parts of Africa, or over parts of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and looking for people who meet certain criteria and taking them out, and then taking out the first responders with a double tap strike. And all of this being done in our name, behind our backs, in ways that are obscure, I would suggest, to most people. So these technologies and of course the meaning then of what it means to be in a war or in a conflict changes irrevocably and quite quickly, and will continue to change. And that's what the techno-critical tradition does, if you like. It looks at the way in which technologies both shape and are shaped by the cultures into which they emerge. And one of the things that are emerging now are these relations of absence, which I think overall, taking the sort of broad view, don't do us much good as human beings.
So are you saying that the lack of proximity to violence is changing the way humans respond to war? Would that?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. I think that's absolutely. I don't know if you've read Gulliver's Travels, but there's an island called Laputa, where a friend of mine told me that the name Laputa comes up in Dr. Strangelove the other day, which I must check out. But anyway, it would certainly fit the idea. So the idea of Laputa, it's sort of populated by professors and intellectuals and mathematicians, and they have these sort of colonies beneath them that they just sort of rain down rocks on. You know, they never have to meet them, they never have to face them in battle or anything like that. Now, the whole sort of emergence of these smart weapons, so-called, was all sort of couched in a language of precision and sort of avoiding collateral damage. Well, the evidence is that they're not very good at avoiding collateral damage, but even if they did, and they might get better at this, it would still fundamentally change the nature of conflict, such that a more technological society can, such as the United States, that's what we're talking about after all, when we're talking about this kind of activity, largely speaking, can, so to speak, rain down rocks on anyone else whose ways of life or whose systems they don't particularly want it. So yes, I think it's undeniable that those the kinds of weapons you have changed the nature of war. That, thinking about Dr. Strangelove, there's a great line in it. I don't know if you remember it, but the Russian ambassador is wrestling with the George C. Scott character, who's spotted him taking photographs of the big board, and the president intervenes and pushes them apart, and he said, "Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room." It's one of the best lines in cinema. You think, yes, that is the kind of logic that began to emerge after the Second World War, as these incredibly powerful weapons necessitated a new way of thinking about conflict as a kind of a game of strategy, if you like. Game theory emerges from precisely that moment in history.
Indeed. Look, when I was reading your book, at a personal level, I think the thing that really stayed with me was the overarching theme of technology as an enabling, but also a limiting extension of the human from our ancestry and antiquity through to modern times. And I think the idea of technology simultaneously being enabling and limiting can be a little bit confronting. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. So there's what's often called the instrumental view of technology, which is the view of technology that you get in sort of Silicon Valley and its equivalents, but Silicon Valley above all, and it's got quite a lot of currency, I would say, generally. And it's as follows: this phone is just a tool. Okay, I can use it wisely, I can use it unwisely, but there's nothing much about the technology itself that demands examination. That's the instrumental view. And then at the other end, you've got deterministic views of technology. The internet's going to make us all into morons, or video is going to make us all into murderers, etc., etc., etc. Between those poles, you have the techno-critical view, or sometimes it's called the substantive view, which, as I said before, looks at the way in which technologies shape and are shaped by the culture into which they emerge. And part of that analysis means looking, yes, at the ways in which, of course, technologies, liberate us. And there's no point being, against technology. I mean, it would be absurd, precisely because our species woke up into technology, precisely because our our ability to use technology as hominids precedes the emergence of our species. In the same way, you know, so we woke up within it, you know, in the same way that anyone on this call kind of woke up in technology this morning, you know, in the form of blankets and a bed and a roof over their head, etc., unless they had a very rough night, I guess. So there's no point being against it, but there's a non sequitur kind of lurking there, and it's kind of fundamental to the Silicon Valley way of looking at things, because what they say is, because we're technological creatures, that anything we do in the name of technology is just a sort of living out of our humanness. It's the living out of our purpose, of our telos, as Aristotle called it. So we're just being humans, and that's what we do. But of course, it's more complicated than that. We've already mentioned weapons, for example, which aren't, well, you know, always particularly conducive to human flourishing. So one has to view technology with some nuance, stand back from it, and think about the ways in which it enables us, what we want to be enabled to do, that's to say what kind of relationship we want with it, and the ways in which it restricts us. I've already talked about the difference between tools that are tools of extension, such as a hammer or a screwdriver, and one wouldn't want to be without them. There are also tools of externalization, like the Predator drone, like the smartphone, which have a different kind of effect on the culture. And so that's what I'm talking about. So that's the sort of way in which technology can be both enabling and restricting. And I had something in my head there that was going to make the point clearer, but it's completely disappeared. So I'll hand back to you. I'll try and think about what it was.
The example in your book, which you mentioned quite early on, was how writing degraded our capacity for memory. Was that the one that was sticking in your mind then too?
It was almost. Thank you, Adrian. Brilliant. Yeah, it was actually the printing press I was thinking of. So the kind of the next, the next thing that often comes up when we think about communication technologies. You got the invention of writing, 5,500 years ago or something like that. And then you've got some development, but then you've got the printing press, of course, with Gutenberg's converted wine press in around 1400, I think. Might have to check. But yeah, I mean, think about printing. Printing is often kind of, especially when the sort of tech bros talking, printing is often kind of pressed into service as an example of, well, look at the print. Don't be against the internet. You're as mad, you're as crazy, you're as reactionary as the people who are against the printing press. But the story of the printing press is a complex one. Yes, of course, it leads over time to the spread of literacy. Yes, it leads over time to the democratization of religion. Yes, it leads over time to the emergence of what we now call the public sphere, in which people can talk to each other across time and space. That's all great. That's the world I live in. I'm not going to take against that. And not only because I've got a book to flog, right? But it also gives you what Benedict Anderson called imagined communities. Okay, so you can start to identify with people who aren't physically present to you. And you know what that gives you? That gives you nationalism. And you know what that gives you? It gives you colonialism, and it gives you imperialism. A friend in Melbourne said to me the other day, and he fleshed it out in the way that I'm hopefully fleshing it out now. The book, printing is great, but the book also gives you Auschwitz, ultimately. So it's not about saying that printing is good or printing is bad. That's not the way to approach it. The way to approach it is to if you like, invite technology back into the discussion about what it means to be a human being, to repoliticize it, and to think, as I say, about what it is that we want from our technology, which, as I say, is also a question about who we are.
Okay, yes. I think one of the things I enjoyed about reading this book was that you're very clear on the direction you're taking with the book as you go through. But one thing that might be a bit mysterious, particularly to people who've only just sort of picked up the book and had a quick look at the cover, is what the monsters are. So my initial supposition was that those monsters might be the perpetrators of the very worst crimes involving modern technologies, and I was expecting a potentially very dark book that ruminated a lot on the suffering that can arise from technology. In fact, I think you meant something a bit different by monsters.
Yeah, thanks. Absolutely. So as everyone on the call will know, I'm sure, the phrase "here be monsters" or "here be dragons," hic sunt dracones, is used to appear on old maps as a sort of, as an indication that certain waters were uncharted. So it was a warning, and the book is a warning about technology. But yes, the monsters don't inhere necessarily in the technologies themselves. They don't inhere even in those who use them for power, although there are, of course, incredible and frightening examples of that throughout history, from the nuclear weapons that were dropped on, or the atomic weapons that were dropped on Japan, to the ovens at Auschwitz. I'm not talking principally about that. What I'm talking about is the way in which human beings, immersed as they are increasingly in a world of very powerful machines, may be becoming, quote unquote, monstrous or uncanny to one another and even to themselves. So if we think about the monster as a kind of metaphor here, monsters are distinguished by their ambiguity. So they seem to fall between the categories. There is ambiguity, for example, about whether a zombie is alive or dead. There's ambiguity, same kind of ambiguity, I guess, about a vampire. It's also ambiguity about whether it's a sort of a bat or a cat or something, or a human being. So this is quite creepy to us. And there's a mechanical or technological version of this in the rogue AI, the sort of the smart machine that becomes so powerful that it crosses a threshold into consciousness and then begins to run amok. And those are all forms of that ambiguity, but there's also the ambiguity. There's also the sort of uncanniness that befalls us, or may yet come to befall us, as we become, as I put it in the book, I think, strange to ourselves and to one another. That's to say, if, as I argue in the book, these increasingly transformative technologies are going against the grain of whatever it is that our human being happens to be, whatever it is about us that happens to be, if you like, non-negotiable, then we are placing ourselves in a situation in which, the monsters are not over there, but here. So yes, there's a little bit of ambiguity in the adverb as well, but that's what I meant, about the monsters. But it's interesting. You can always tell as well when a reviewer hasn't kind of read the book, which you clearly have. Because they'll say, the monster of AI or something like that. You think, right, yes, you didn't get beyond page 2. That's fine. That's my problem.
Yeah. I guess it's something all writers have to live with, is the omnipotent reviewer who forms opinions without actual evidence. Okay. So probably the single new technology that's been most prominent in the public eye over the last year or so is generative artificial intelligence, and Chat GPT is the prime example. How do the ideas you raise in Here Be Monsters relate to this technology?
Yeah. Well, it sounds perverse, this, but in a way, I got a bit lucky, didn't I? In the sense that Chat GPT seemed to emerge just as the book was sort of going to print, and it did actually make it into the book. But yeah, I'm not sure how lucky we are in the end. Yeah, look, I think Chat GPT and the large and the sort of generative AI in general is really interesting because it demonstrates, I think, the limitations of how we talk about technology at the moment. Marx says somewhere that what is it he says? He said, yes, people tend to view historical developments from the point of view of developments that have already happened, much like a person learning a new language habitually translates it back into the one they already know. It's a very good point. They do precisely that. And that seemed to me to be happening with ChatGPT. Bias, accuracy, toxicity, etc., etc., etc. All the things that were kind of in the public conversation already as a consequence of fake news, post-truth, important issues, don't get me wrong. You know, that's what the debate was. It might be worth just pausing to say that was OpenAI's plan all along. I hope I don't sound like a conspiracy theorist, but the whole point of releasing not Chat GPT, to give it its proper name, GPT 3.5, was to finesse the system and make it as user-friendly as possible ahead of bringing in GPT-4, which it has now done. So it wanted to create a stink. It wanted to create discussion. It wanted to create anxiety about this thing so that it could make it more saleable. Now, it seems to me that those are important questions, of course, but all data sets have biases. Okay, the academic databases that I use at university have biases. You know, they all have inaccuracies. It's possible to conceive of a ChatGPT style system that doesn't have inaccuracies. I mean, or that's at least as competent as the internet. I know the internet has plenty of inaccuracies, don't get me wrong, but it's largely trained on the internet. You could make it better. You could make it, you know, you could make it as good as anything that's kind of there already. That's not the principal problem with it from my point of view. The principal problem with it, or the principal issue with it, the thing that we should be thinking about is that it is yet another encroachment upon and an unbidden one, and an unsolicited one. It is yet another, which makes me kind of cranky. It is yet another encroachment upon our agency. Okay, so I do a bit of teaching. I know that in order to create a good essay, a student needs to go through the steps that I teach her to go through. That you can't separate the conclusion of an essay from those steps. That's how cognitive ability is built. What ChatGPT does in counterfeiting, okay, not reproducing, but counterfeiting the way in which human beings might think about things, is to take a large chunk of that process away from us and invite us just to take a kind of shortcut. So it is, again, in my terms, a technology of externalization, and it's a black box. Okay, so the notion of black boxes comes up quite a lot in the book, and a black box is a term from science and engineering. It means you know what the inputs are and you know what the outputs are. What goes on in between is anybody's guess. So what it does, it makes, again, and like so many of the technologies now, it makes some of which we used to understand, like the car. You know, can't understand modern cars. I mean, they go wrong, you need to get someone in, right? Like so many of the technologies now, it makes the world opaque to us in a way that is very alienating, I think, again, quite anxiety making in ways that aren't obvious, but in ways that are certainly in prospect.
Yes, I see especially how it would present a challenge in an educational context, and comes back also to your concept of technology as a limiting phenomena as well as an enabling phenomena. So we've just passed the halfway point of the session. is there anyone here who would like to ask Richard a question or perhaps make an observation? You're most welcome to type it into the chat or put your hand up using the Zoom hand up function too. Or indeed, with the limited numbers, you may just turn your microphone on and say, hi, I've got a question.
Hi, I've got a question. I'm sorry I was late joining you. I'm in England, and life is. I just wanted to know what his bona fides are. Presumably, when you introduced him, you told us all his wonderful things that he knows and does, and I missed that. So could you just kind of fill us in? He's obviously coming from a philosophical end, so I just wonder what his bona fides are.
Well, Richard, I think perhaps the best thing would be if I refer that question directly to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Bona fides. Well, I'm a journalist and a generalist. I'm not an academic. I got myself a master's in literary history and cultural discourse, but very much the aim with this book was to come at it from, if you like, a humanistic perspective and not worry too much about well, obviously I know a lot more about technology than I did when I was before I wrote the book, but not worry that I wasn't about the fact that I wasn't an expert in technology. And the publisher kind of encouraged me in that regard, because there are so few books that sort of treat of technology in this way. Funnily enough, in the 60s and the 70s, that it was a feature really of the movements that together make up what we now call the New Left, that they did think quite rigorously about technology. And you have books like Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. Frankfurt School was very interested in technology. But apart from that, I am an English born, as you can probably tell, journalist living in Australia, and widely published second book. I hope that's satisfactory.
Oh, thank you. So you would say that you were an informed layman?
Yes.
If I can put it that way.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much. I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to be rude.
No.
It's really, it's good to know where people come from, what their thinking patterns have been, as it were. I
totally agree. And the other thing, Alison, is that I was very interested in it from a political point of view. So I sit on the this doesn't speak so much to my bona fides, but to the angle I'm coming from. So I sit very firmly on the sort of what we used to call the material left, and there was a lot of excitement on the left, or sort of hedged excitement, I guess, after the debt crisis of 2007-8, because it looked like the whole capitalist system might be coming apart, and there was a lot of sort of techno-utopianism around. People like Paul Mason and sort of old accelerationists, we would have called them back in the day, who were thinking, oh well, there's this new form of, there's this new raw material that's kind of in the world, and they're really struggling to make a profit off it, and the price of everything is going to collapse to zero, and we're all going to be living in sort of fully automated luxury communist world before long. And that, as you can probably tell by the slightly sardonic way in which I describe it, didn't strike me as quite something that was in prospect. And so I was interested in it from that political angle as well. And it did seem to me that a sort of tradition of sort of left philosophical thinking about this issue of technology had gone very quiet of late, and had gone quiet at a time when, because of the transformative power of the new technologies that are sort of coming into being, it was very much needed. So I come at it from that angle as well, as someone interested in justice and in all of those lovely shibboleths we we on the left love to.
The other thing I think you need to say about monsters is they're really scary because they're unknown.
They are, and the weird thing is, about monsters is that they get scarier if they're a bit more known. So if you think of like Godzilla or King Kong, Godzilla and King Kong don't scare me. Maybe they scare some people, but a zombie, then it gets scarier. So there's something called the uncanny valley, and this idea, you probably heard of it, but this idea was put together by a sort of techno guy in Japan, and he said it's interesting. What happens is that people, when the models, the sort of AI android type models that he was making got more and more human-like, people's empathy with them really dropped off quite sharply as they approached humanness. But as he got so close that it became almost impossible to distinguish the android from a real human being, the empathy went back up again. So there is something about, and this is why I find the notion of monsters and of uncanniness such a sort of serviceable metaphor, I suppose, because, you know, you only have to change a little bit for it to become quite weird, you know. And if you think about, I mean, talking about technology, we're talking about uncanniness. If you've ever been around someone who's had a lot of sort of beautifying, in quotation marks, sort of plastic surgery or something, you know, and it's perhaps not the best quality, you sort of think, oh my goodness, why did you do that to yourself? You know what I mean? But yes, they are unknown, and some of them terrify me.
Now, Richard, we have a question in the chat from Jeff, and he's asking, do you think technology has changed human nature, given the new phenomenon of trolling? Have we become ruder, or is our existing rudeness just being unleashed?
We've become rude in a different way, I would say. I'll take it in two parts. Has it changed human nature? No. I don't. I mean, yes, it has. Technology has changed human nature in the sense that human beings co-evolved with technology, in a way that's quite interesting. So, as I think I did say before, the use of tools predates the emergence of Homo sapiens. So we'd already discovered, hominids had already discovered fire. What does fire allow you to do? It allows you to keep warm. It also allows you to cook your food. That acts as a form of pre-digestion. It breaks down plant cell walls. It means that you have to use less energy to break those down yourself. That frees up energy for more thought, which can be put to other things. It also means that you don't have to have, you know, a lot of hair or whatever. So in that sense, yes, technology does change human nature. But these things, we are talking about very, very long stretches of time here. And in terms of my sort of three aspects of human being, the social, the physical, and the creative, no, I don't think sort of the technologies that have emerged in the last 20 years have changed human nature in that sense. They are so sort of set that we may as well regard them as static. Of course, we may intervene in our own nature now with CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology and just decide to synthesize new types of human beings. I mean, I don't think that's in prospect, but it is now possible. But I don't think digital technology, for example, has changed human nature. And that's the problem, because in key ways it goes against, I would argue, our human nature or our human sort of natural cultural being. Has social media made us ruder? Yes, it has. I talked, when I was talking about printing just earlier, about the emergence of a public sphere. Around the public sphere, because you're talking to people across space and time, certain conventions emerge. You become aware that you are talking sort of across this public sphere. It's not an agora like the one that Socrates, you know, did his philosophy in, and so people tend to talk in a different way. What social media has done is, if you like, collapse the personal back into the public sphere. So everything becomes very immediate. So it is both a personal space and a political space at the same time. That means that people are always, if you like, much touchier than they would be otherwise. That makes them much ruder. That causes certain problems. It leads, I would argue, as well, to a downgrading of the kind of debate that you would hope for.
And Jeff has actually asked a follow-up question about the polarization of society, and I think that's probably exactly what you're coming to now.
Absolutely, absolutely, 100%. And it does lead to greater polarization. You know, in and around 2011, just as it was all kicking off in the Maghreb and in the Middle East, and with the Occupy movement and the Indignados in Spain, a lot of the tech bros were saying, well, this just proves it. You know, here we have a sort of democratic technology that is, you know, if you like, that is going to engender a new form of politics. And there was some truth in that. But what you actually find 10, 12 years later is that the people who do really well off this technology are the ones who can sort of, you know, if you like, rouse up people's feelings, because feelings have now, as I say, the personal has now collapsed back into that public space in a way that makes it neither a purely personal space nor a purely public space. It just becomes a zone of mutual surveillance in which everyone is sort of, either being rude to each other, but also, which I think is just as big a problem, agreeing with each other in the most kind of just superficial, boring terms all the time, like this, like this, like this. Yes, that's a great one, you know, clap, clap, clap. And it's weird. It's weird. Again, we crave connection, and it is a form of connection. So I don't want to be rude about the people that spend a lot of time on social media. I mean, I'm on Twitter, but I don't like it very much. I feel I kind of have to be, just to, you know, as a journalist, just to see what's going on. But I wouldn't be rude about the people that are on it. But I don't think it does the public sphere any favors at all, to be honest.
Okay, now we have another question. I think this one's from Tammy, actually. And she says, I'm interested in your use of the word opaque and technology's contribution to this. Could you tell us more?
Opaque. So there are technologies that you can look at. A pair of glasses, for example, you know how they work. In fact, these glasses are literally opaque. No, they're literally not opaque.
Yeah.
Other way around. You know how they work. So it goes to this question of the black box. What you have now are technologies that really no one has a clue about. And even, it's interesting that even the developers, or the trainers, as they're sometimes called, whose job it is to sort of finesse and build these data sets on which the large language models are based, even they don't really know what's going on, because they are now neural networks. They are recursive in a way that even their creators don't quite understand. When Kasparov was beaten at chess by a computer, everyone knew what it was doing. Okay, it was just brute force calculation. All right, it was just going. It was just had like an incredible number of games in its database. It went through them all. It worked out the best moves, and it beat him. Okay, and we know that chess is a finite game. You know, it's a fantastically complex game, but it's a finite game. Now, the game of Go, on the other hand, the Chinese game of Go, is much more intuitive. Presumably, it's finite, okay, at some incredible level, but it's much more intuitive. The computer that beat Lee Sedol at Go made a move, who was the Go champion at the time, made a move that no expert understood. It was completely counterintuitive. The people running the system didn't understand it. All they understood was that the machine had made a move that no human being would ever make. So that's a good demonstration of what I mean by opaque. but more mundanely than that, think of the car, think of your dad, or or indeed your mum, although back in the day it was usually your dad, tinkering with the spark plugs at the weekend, chipping the things off, checking the oil, all that sort of thing. I mean, you open up the hood now and what you've got is another hood underneath. So things that used to be, if you like, visible to us are becoming invisible to us in a way that I think is ultimately quite alienating. There are certain things that doesn't really matter whether you know how they work or not, I guess. But when that relationship comes to characterize so many of the technologies that we use now, it does something to our agency and to our sense of agency, and that's very important for our sense of freedom. There's a tendency to think about freedom as just, what you have when there's nobody sitting there bossing you around. Well, that's a very kind of classical liberal idea of freedom. And as a lefty, I have a different idea of freedom, which is the freedom to actually, make your own world, to make your own way in the world, to create for yourself the conditions in which you can flourish. And part of that is being a creative person, whether it's through the job that you do or the art that you make or the books that you write, in my case, whatever it is, people need to feel as if they're having some material effect upon the world. So that's why, kind of opaque technologies are so important within the thesis of the book.
Okay, now I think we've got time for just one more quick question, actually, and Carol's written in the chat. I haven't yet read your book, Richard, but I am wondering if you can imagine council culture as the psychological equivalent of clicking off a website.
Whoa. Cancel culture as the psychological. I think I would tend to think about it, the cancel culture, as a symptom of the technology, as in part a symptom of the technology itself, in the sense that, and as I said before, what what Elon Musk likes to call the sort of digital public square is a space in which is neither purely personal nor purely public. It's both, always, at the same time. And I think what cancel culture is, in part, is a response to that situation in which people increasingly take things, if they're badly phrased or they're just rude, whatever, very, very personally. Okay, so I think it is partly marbled into the kinds of technologies that is. I mean, clicking off a website cancel culture, yeah, it's a good metaphor, but I think I think cancel culture is a very interesting phenomenon, and I think technology probably has as much to do with that phenomenon as anything, in the sense that we can all now talk all of the time, and some of us do, and we have to be increasingly careful about what it is that we say, precisely because this space into which we're talking, or to which we're talking, is both a personal and a public space. So it's a really interesting question, actually. I hadn't thought about the kind of relationship between cancel culture and technology, but I like the metaphor.
Okay. Well, I think we could probably go on for another full hour if we had the time, but unfortunately we have come to the end of our allotted time. So I would just like to say thank you so much, Richard, for sharing with us your perspective and for taking the time to offer everyone deeper insights into your ideas and the way that you've come about to write this book. I'd also just like to thank the audience for your inquisitive participation this evening. It's great to have these forums to learn more about the big ideas. For those of you who would like to rewatch tonight's talk, a recording will be available online soon. And for those of you who would like to borrow a copy of Here Be Monsters, please contact your local library branch to make the request, and we'll put a reservation in for you.
That's one technology I'm very much in favour of, library. The Dewey Decimal System of classification.
Aren't we all? Okay, so again, thank you everyone, and have a good night.